Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Today I'm in the Artist Project space at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art with artist Matthew Picton and his exhibition, Cultural Mapping. Born in London, Picton studied politics and history at the London School of Economics. He has been a professional artist since 1998, exhibiting his work widely in the US and in Europe. Cultural Mapping is on view through January 20th, 2019. Thanks, Matthew, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning, because I know your journey is an interesting one. We're going to be a politics and history study at the London School of Economics. So how did you get here?
Right. It's a good question, and I mean, it seems to be a far remove in some respects, but I was studying politics and history, and whilst interested in the subject matter, I found that there was a lack of ability to create anything. I wanted to create, not only physically create something, but create something original. And to me, just sort of wading through endless tomes in the library and creating some essays about subject matter wasn't going to quite do that for me. Plus, I also met a friend who was going to art school at the time. And it just seemed very exciting, what he was doing, where he was going. And so I thought, well, I could start doing that as well. It was a long journey. I mean, it took me a lot of years experimenting and not quite getting really down to it until I moved to San Francisco, really.
And then everything changed.
Well, I wouldn't say everything changed. It was again a slow process of like acquiring skills and sort of abilities and direction at the same time.
So how did you come to be fascinated by cartography? Mapping?
Well, cartography is something I've always been fascinated by, and I grew up in England where going for the ritual Sunday walk is part of the fabric of living, and you'd be forced out whether you liked it or not, and of course your father would be out there with his big map collection, pore over it and see which boggy fields you're going to walk through that Sunday. And but we used to go to Scotland every year and pore over more of these very detailed maps, and I used to love them and sort of start to imagine the sort of possibilities of landscape and eventually history from them. So that's how it started, and even early on when I started painting, I used to sort of inscribe sort of cartographic forms into those pieces, and this was when I was about 23 or 4.
So one of the major series that you've done, and there's one piece in this show which is from the series, is the City series.
That's right.
So tell us how you started working on the City series and how that work's evolved over time.
Well, the City series emerged from, I think initially in one way, just because there is a sort of wonderful sense of abstraction when you particularly look down from, say, the top of the Eiffel Tower down onto the spreading form of Paris. And I started just creating these three-dimensional map sculptures of the infrastructure of cities. And while I was creating those pieces, you couldn't help but imagine the history. And in so doing, the work transitioned into pieces that contained visual imagery, text, and historic maps at the same time, required greater depth. And then imagery from film and music scores and everything else sort of was able to then come into the piece.
So tell us about the one piece here, Berlin, 1928 to 1988. Just can you say a little bit about that piece specifically?
Well, that's a good piece. I mean, it's a sculpture of the divided Berlin, essentially, pre the war coming down. And so the larger area in the piece, which is the whiter area, is the surface of that is taken from Wim Wenders' film, The Wings of Desire, and the darker area is from The Lives of Others, which is a film set in East Berlin during the Stasi years. So that's essentially the surface of the piece, and when you look into the sculpture itself, there is imagery from a map of Berlin from 1932 that's been fragmented with some of the imagery from Fassbinder's Berlin Alexanderplatz film, and that also the wall itself has imagery from all the paintings that adorned the wall before it was destroyed. So there are many layers of imagery. The Fassbinder film is looking at the Berlin of the pre-war, the 28, the pre sort of rise of Nazism when the city was starting to fall to pieces, whereas the Wim Wenders film has the echoing space of the post-war period.
So tell us a little bit about the technique. You've mentioned these layers and all the different kinds of materials that you introduce. Our viewers will see that there are these layers. There's a whole series of successive layers. How do you do that?
Well, I create series of templates. So in this case, we have a more modern map and we have an older map. So the first thing to do is to try to line up the scale between the older map and the new map, and then create paper templates and cut through with an X-Acto knife on different tables and layers. So the back layer has been set aside, cut through, the template peeled off, everything that's within it pinned into the surface underneath, and the top layer likewise similarly. So it's a sort of a sculpture that requires 6 or 7 tables to lay out each section before finally they're all assembled together and pinned together.
And that particular piece is framed, but we're standing in front of a piece here, and this piece behind us, which is also in a frame. But this one, I know you assemble each time it's displayed. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, look, it's a massive piece.
Yes, it's a massive piece. I mean, it's like the one constraint with the frame is that, well, the weight of the frame, the size of the plexiglass, there's a constraint, and at round about 6 feet is you're really going to be getting into some big problems. When, weight-wise, it would just be impossible. Plus, expense-wise, those plastic sheets become custom-made and a fortune. And so, this particular subject matter demanded scale. And I mean, and there's a smaller one over there with a lot of the river system missing because I had to sort of condense it. And so I decided to just to leave the frame behind and create something that was site-specific. And mount it all in pieces so that I could attain the scale of the geography and topography.
Right, so let's talk a little bit about the majority of the pieces that are in this show are about the Congo, the Amazon, and the Mekong River basins.
That's right.
So the exhibition catalog, which is a beautiful catalog, includes an essay of yours titled Mapping Conquest and Colonialism. So tell us about how these works about these river systems express your interest in mapping conquest and colonialism.
Well, each one of them reflects a degree of colonial exploration, essentially. And they're all about mapping, and I think the pieces start with the one behind you there, Paul, which is the one El Dorado. And that's looking back historically to the early days of colonialism, the Spanish plunder of that particular period, and that sort of set the tone and the template for what was then to occur in the Congo with these pieces, and ultimately with this piece in the Mekong as well, in a sort of more modernized version. Each one having relationships and links to a previous period.
So tell us about some of the material that is in play here.
Well, in play here, there were a lot of actually unknown engravings by 19th century engravers who were busily depicting El Dorado. El Dorado held a fascination for centuries. The Spanish believed in it, and later on, Victorian explorers believed in it too. And so there was legend has it there was a king who lived on the shores of a lake, and he was adorned and anointed in gold every morning. And so they busily made these quite fantastic engravings of the imagined scenes, and also they depicted on the map where Manoa on Lake Parim was meant to exist, which was somewhere between modern day Venezuela and Brazil. in some sort of area there. And there was speculation as to, well, why did they believe this was there to start with? And there was some possibility that the rivers used to create these massive floods of many tens of thousands of acres at certain times of the year, and that maybe someone had seen this flooding and believed that this was it. But there were expeditions for 300 years looking for that, and it was actually on the map. That was so incredible that the old maps for 3 centuries had it on there as fact.
So how do you get from the Amazon to the Congo?
Well, the Amazon and the Congo, it's a good question. They're linked by the fact of time period. I mean, it was there in the early 1900s when the big rubber boom was going on in the Amazon basin, and it's famously producing Manaus and the Opera House in Manaus, and there was a pretty sort of horrible sort of period of extraction and semi-slavery. But at exactly the same time in history, there in the Congo basin, there was a similar type of and more hidden process going on with King Leopold's Belgian Congo, and there was like enormous slavery, an enormous sort of death and enormous destruction went on during this period. And it seemed kind of fascinating as a parallel that these two almost like lung-shaped intricacies of river system were sort of being infiltrated by the poison of the West at the same time. So that's how I then moved to the Congo.
So tell us about the material that is in the history of the Congo River #2, this large piece behind you.
Well, this large piece behind us has, underneath the surface forms, there are sort of partially visible elements of a comic book novel made by Jean Saint-Michel of the early Mobutu eras, which was somewhat of a sort of propaganda magazine, really, when it came down to it, but provided an interesting visual history of the period. At the same time, Tishibumba and other artists were creating a series of paintings which were very confrontational to the ruling ideology at the time. And they were mostly creating paintings of the death and assassination of Lumumba. And Lumumba was the first leader of the Free Congo, and he was not too well liked by the former masters and other factions who could see that his particular economic bent was going to mean that for them losing control of the resources. So by some sort of maneuvering, eventually Mobutu came into power. So the imagery on those is mostly of Lumumba's period leading up to his assassination and his death, but also there's imagery from masks from the Luba Kingdom, which were the pre-colonial, pre-Belgian era Luba Kingdom, which had an incredible ancient history of artistry and delight. Sorry.
So the first Congo piece, that also has a component of Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness.
Yes, that has that as well. I mean, the Heart of Darkness. I mean, it's less. I mean that the Heart of Darkness actually enters the text and imagery more in the Mekong piece in the centre here. I mean, and is more sort of relative to the Apocalypse Now piece over there. But the Heart of Darkness, I mean, I actually didn't introduce text into these two pieces. I thought about it, but it just wasn't quite right. That text ended up in the next piece. So even though that, of course, the Heart of Darkness emerged from that period, Joseph Conrad visited the Congo in those early 1900s and was appalled by what he witnessed. And the Heart of Darkness was born out of that, which actually led eventually to the overthrow of Leopold's rule there.
So you've already begun to explain how you get from the Congo to the Mekong, and these two pieces, Apocalypse Now 1 and Apocalypse Now 2. Tell us about those pieces.
Well, Apocalypse Now is a very famous film, obviously, and Coppola looked to the Heart of Darkness as his inspiration, and he was making a film about Vietnam, of course, at the time. and he claims to have loosely based it upon the story, but it maintains enough similarity to the original story to be somewhat faithful, I think. And he basically recontextualized that tale into the present, into the 1960s in the Mekong. And so the film moves back and forward in a sense between that original novel and the contemporary experience in Vietnam.
So tell us about some of the materials that are actually literally in these two pieces.
Well, the materials are mostly paper, but in the piece on the right here, we have imagery from the film and one central image of Captain Leon Rom, who is one of the figures that Kurtz was based upon. There were three potential pieces that figures that Conrad could have based Kurtz upon during his time. There were at least, there were these very sort of bloody figures, one whose whole house was surrounded by skulls, and so I think he created Kurtz from that, and so that became that figure. There are also figures of the images of the playgirls from the helicopter when it lands in the middle of the jungle and such things like that.
And what about this, the second?
Well, the second piece has got a greater width of texture to it. I mean, that has imagery from the Viet. There were a lot of war artists in the Viet Cong side during the war, and so some of the imagery is taken from those artists' depiction of the war. Some of the imagery is actually from the film, and it's been blurred and scraped and stained in colour, so that the visual imagery between the fiction and the fact is quite blurred between the two. And then there's a central image taken from the film poster of Kurtz, and there's also text from The Heart of Darkness in that piece as well.
Can you say a little bit about the red in that one?
Well, the red is obviously, the red is the entire Mekong River system as it comes down into the delta. So, and the red obviously has connotations of a bloodstream, but it also has an arterial connection at the same time. It's like the river is seen as a series of arteries in a being or a body or a landscape or a land mass.
One other question I have is, most of the pieces in this show are circular.
That's right, yeah.
Why? Why circles?
Well, there are really two reasons for that. The circle in itself is a powerful form and relates obviously globally to the sphere that we live in. And also, it's because the geography always continues further. So where do you exactly draw the line? It's like, otherwise it's an arbitrary form, and any arbitrary form has to have some type of boundary to it. So whether it's misshapen or it's a square, none of it's going to be quite right. Yes, if you could only encompass all of it, which is always the conundrum. And that's the same with cities. They have an amazing form as they spread out to the edge, but you can never make a sculpture big enough to actually encompass the whole thing. So the square was the solution to the problem. The circle was the solution to the problem.
So you mentioned in the Mekong River Apocalypse Now 2, the way that you blurred or worked up the images to sort of blur fact and fiction. Say a little bit more about your understanding of the relationship between fact and fiction in your work.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I feel like there's always recorded history, which is always going to be a bit subjective, if not a lot subjective. There's recollections, there's memories, there's people's apparent knowledge or memory of any given event that are then interpreted. So there's already some coloration. And then there's the filmmaker who's going in to sort of create maybe a narrative, but at the same time is sort of making a sort of documentary, but taking some liberties at the same time. And so inevitably there's an interplay between the two. And then there's the interplay of the viewer, which the viewer has sort of inhabiting them cinematic imagery, which sometimes I don't actually feel like leaves people. And so I think in terms of this sort of Apocalypse Now situation, I feel that the troops going in already had ideas about what it was meant to be like to be at war, because they'd seen films of it, right? And so they made a film about these a film about people going to war, and it has a sort of ironic type of form to it in the sense that it's a war film. It's sort of like a documentary, but it's also posing as a war film at the same time. So there's already a blur between what's fiction, what's correct, what isn't.
You started out studying politics and history, and all through our discussion, you've been talking about history in a variety of different ways. Right. Say a little bit about your understanding of the relationship between art and history.
Art and history. Well, to me, art is always is either the reflector of history or it's the precursor of history. So, I mean, if you looked at the Doblin novel, the Berlin-Alexanderplatz, and obviously the film is made years later after the event, but the novel, you know, as an art form is seeing the destruction coming, and just like the pre-Nazi era artists in 20s Berlin, I mean, they're sort of shrieking, horrible pictures, paintings of the period, all point to a catastrophe looming, but they're like sort of the canary in the coal mine, sort of, you know, they're the harbingers of fates to come. So I see that relation there is one of, it's sometimes an unconscious reflection.
So I know from the work that you've done of cities and now these river systems, you tend to work in series, and they can go on for many years. Yeah. So you've done these all of the river pieces that are in the show are all from 2018. Is this part of a much longer, I mean, are you imagining further river systems works?
Yes and no. I mean, it's like I'm extending the Apocalypse Now theme into a slightly different area. Because to me, there's further to go with that particular theme, and that doesn't involve another river. That involves a somewhat different project, which is looking more back into the medieval idea and notion of the apocalypse, specifically as seen by Dorado. And that, to me, sort of takes the idea backwards in time, where there was, you know, the apocalypse was something that was on people's minds seemingly in that era of history perpetually. The end of the world was something that people always were thinking about, and there was a lot of sort of superstition and fate. And I think it's particularly relevant to the time we live in now, where I think there's massive anxiety around the whole world with the sort of ecological troubles that are gathering increasing pace, the sort of, you know, the protectionist ideologies that are going on politically at the same time. And so you know, I'm moving away slightly, but back to the idea of doing more rivers. I mean, I have some thoughts about some other river systems, and particularly the Ganges, but it's not a related project topic-wise to these. Mm-hmm. So that's really something where I might wait and gather more material and decide which approach to take, and that, you know, so there's not an urgent one, but I think maybe in a couple of years I'll have the approach and the material, and then I might embark upon it.
Can you say a little bit about the kind of research you do before you start making the pieces?
Well, obviously the first thing is, with the wonders of modern technology, is you can very quickly get a quick overview of something on your little tablet, right? And then, having done that, I will then look for books, and books are the primary sort of method of research. And again, nowadays you can acquire just about anything, because, you know, there are various online sellers, and you can research all the titles, and they'll send you to other titles. And I tend to buy a few stacks of books, and then look and search amongst those for what I need to find and read around the subject, and that is the usual method. And
you also go to the places often?
Whenever possible, yeah. I mean, yes, I mean, I've been to most of them, not all of them, but generally around this exhibit here. I haven't been to the Congo, but I mean, I have been to parts of Africa and parts of West Africa, and obviously Berlin, and Venezuela and those countries. So I do go, and of course but I don't think it's essential. I mean, you don't have to, because, you know, it's an imagined universe at the same time, so I can create something without having been there.
How long does it take to do one of these pieces? That's not even a fair question, I don't know.
Well, you know, in the case of this big piece behind us here, this took, I worked on it on and off for about 9 months. You know, as I started, I thought, you know, I've got like 9 months for the show here, so I'll just start doing it in sections. And of course, once I got going, I mean, I'm thinking, God, it's going to take ages, you know. There were so many layers and to keep cutting all these different pieces out. And so there was some long weeks' work involved in that one. But the other pieces, you know, I tend to like, I like a couple of months to actually create the whole thing and find all the stuff and, yeah.
So I also know that you get commissions to do work.
Yes, I do.
So tell us about your attitude about commissioned work and how you fit that in.
Oh, commissions are always funny because you get something and you think, oh, great, and you think, what am I going to do about that? Because I usually might well not know anything about it at all. And so then there's a sort of initial scramble to try and see what there is and what you can actually make. Usually, though, they tend to turn into interesting. They're interesting in their own right, but they're also interesting because they push you to expand materially or conceptually, because it will be not something that you are necessarily planning on doing, but and it will demand some different approaches. So I look upon them as a challenge, but a welcome challenge, and so, you know, and I have 2 or 3 going at the moment, and of course, you know, they pay as well at the time, which is good because obviously you have to keep making a living.
So you just mentioned that you're working on 2 or 3 at a time. Yeah. Is it typically the case that you're working on multiple pieces at the same time?
Oh yes, very much. Yeah, I mean, I'm working on 4 pieces at the moment at home.
And are any of them as large as this one?
Actually, I'm doing the project for a hotel in San Luis Obispo, and it's a big piece. It's like 2 8x4 panels, so it's not quite that big, but it's big though. And so I've got started on that, and it's about the history and the archaeology of San Luis Obispo. It's a massive piece, and it's a very detailed close-up project that I'm doing.
How long does it take you to do that kind of project?
Oh, it's taking a while. I mean, I've been doing other things, but you know, it's sort of extending itself over 6 months, that particular piece. So.
Can I ask you about this one? How long did it take you to hang this piece?
Oh well, when Claire and I first put this up, it took us all day. You know, it was an 8-hour event, that one, working hard. But when we came here this time, we got some practice in. And actually, we got this up in only 4.5 hours last time. So maybe we should like time ourselves and see if we can beat the record in the Schneider.
Well, Matthew, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's really been an interesting conversation.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Paul. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. Yeah.
I've been speaking with the artist Matthew Picton. His exhibition, Cultural Mapping, is on view at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art through January 20th, 2019. Thanks so much for watching.